now face. Let's go over some key terms. Linear means predictable changes in a line. Nonlinear means unpredictable, even exponential changes. A big problem with climate science is that scientists' modeling is based on the last 100 years of linear environmental changes. Unfortunately, what we have been experiencing lately is nonlinear. 60% of the total biomass of the animal kingdom has disappeared. That means that's not the total species, right? That means the biomass, the total weight of wild animals has disappeared. Notice how there's not as many birds in the sky, or maybe not as many bugs in your windshield this spring. The loss of wildlife has been nonlinear. This is the campfire in Paradise, California. Over 1 billion insured damages. It was the most expensive natural disaster on Earth for 2018. This wasn't a hot day in the summertime, and this was in November, right around Thanksgiving. Paradise probably had snow on the ground in parts of the city. My name's Daniel, by the way. I used to be a firefighter up around Paradise, and that's why I know a lot of the details about the campfire. The horrors that transpired in Paradise that day are unspeakable. 95% of man-made structures were destroyed. So not 5%, not 10% of the city. If 10% of Paradise had burned down, it would be really bad. Imagine if 20% of a city like Oakland burning to the ground. That would be a disaster, right? No, 95% of Paradise was incinerated by the campfire in one day. On short notice, 27,000 people were ordered to evacuate. Many of them were trapped and burned over while they were trying to do so. Over 100 people died, and it's still missing persons and unidentified remains 2 years later. A lot of the city still looks post-apocalyptic. This is John Muir Glacier in Alaska. Ice has retreated 7 miles up the canyon and decreased in thickness by over a half mile. Australia's wildfire season this year was unprecedented. Over 1 billion rare, unique, non-insect animals perished. Check out the damage done to Kangaroo Island and how much of Australia was burned. Over 30 million acres have been scorched. To put that in perspective, that's more than all the wildfires in North America during 2016, 2017, and 2018 combined. This Australian family had to jump in their pond to escape the smoke and the heat. The fire itself is not what kills you. What kills you in a fire is breathing in superheated gases. Luckily, no one in this family were burned. They are alive and safe today. People are starting to wake up to the climate crisis. It's not really mainstream yet, but it is getting there. One of the biggest misconceptions about climate change is that it's really complicated. People think it's this science thing, right? But it's really not complicated. It's getting warmer, right? So fires are starting and ice is melting. You don't need a PhD to work that out. It would be one thing if all of these changes came without a warning. The most infuriating part of climate change is that we were warned for decades about what is happening right now. In 1895, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, this guy Svante Arrhenius predicted that the Arctic would get 14.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer if atmospheric CO2 was doubled. Fast forward 93 years, the IPCC is born. This is the point at which anthropogenic climate change is internationally and undeniably known. That's another key term. Anthropogenic means human-caused. So when someone says anthropogenic climate change, that means human-caused climate change. In 1992, 4 years after the IPCC was created, the World Scientist Warning to Humanity was published by the Union of Concerned Scientists. It was signed by thousands of scientists, including over half of living Nobel Prize winners. It said, "Our massive tampering with the world's interdependent web of life, coupled with the environmental damage inflicted by deforestation, species loss, and climate change, could trigger unpredictable collapses of critical biological systems whose interactions and dynamics we only imperfectly understand. Uncertainty over the extent of these effects cannot excuse complacency or delay in facing the threats." This was in 1992. Fast forward 25 years, the Union of Concerned Scientists gave humanity a second notice. It was published in Geoscience, a highly respected, peer-reviewed journal from the American Institute of Biological Sciences. Then, within 2 years of the second notice, the Union of Concerned Scientists, now around 20,000 scientists strong, including most all current Nobel Prize winners, just published the World Scientist Warning of a Climate Emergency in Geoscience, the same peer-reviewed academic journal. So there's obviously some kind of disconnect, right? There's a big gap between the public's knowledge and what the scientists are saying. The Union of Concerned Scientists is clearly not getting through to everyday people. I don't know about you, but most all people I talk to think that climate change is something to do with polar bears, or something to do with the Amazon, or something that brown people in poor countries have to worry about. It's simply not, it's too futuristic, right? Or it has no proximity to regular Americans. Extinction Rebellion is about bridging that gap. It's about shining an undeniable spotlight on this undeniable blind spot. The goal of XR is real, meaningful change. It's about applying proven strategies to bridge that gap between scientists and the public. All right, I'm sure some of you might be wondering, why is he calling climate change a predicament? Or is this some kind of mad radical guy? It's a crazy world out there, so I understand the concern. But this is not about me. It's not about my political views or some other ideology, right? This is about the facts. And when it comes to climate change, there's a few killer facts. The first killer fact is related to the melting of Arctic sea ice. It's not complicated. It's just ice floating around on the North Pole. Earth has these really important ice sheets, right? These ice sheets are something like a cooler. Keeping ice on the planet's cooler is important for weather stability. The reason why is because with less ice, the difference in temperatures between the equator and the Arctic becomes less, which affects seasonal weather. It increases the chance of this thing called a multi-breadbasket failure, which just means crop failures across the northern hemisphere. Think mass starvation in the USA. These graphs are from peer-reviewed research papers. This one was shown to see what the ice looked like the last 1,450 years. Scary stuff, right? Anyone can see what is going on in these graphics, right? In the last 20 years, over 75% of the volume of Arctic sea ice has melted. So not 5%, not 15%. If 15% of the Arctic sea ice had melted, then that would be concerning. No, 75% of the ice has already melted. It's a disaster. Take a look at how many times in the last 10 years Arctic sea ice has dropped below the 95% confidence interval. Looks like we would be lucky to still have ice by 2025, right? Now look where it says zero ice. So sea ice extent means how much of the Arctic Ocean is covered by sea ice. Sea ice volume means the total amount of sea ice. When Arctic sea ice melts, it warms the air around Greenland. This causes land ice to melt, which then causes sea levels to rise. Here's a video from Climate Central showing what sea level rise looks like for New York and California. Ever been in the snow on a sunny day? It's extremely bright. Right? You need goggles or sunglasses on to see anything. That's because snow and ice reflect the sun like a mirror. It's the same mechanism in the Arctic. Arctic sea ice reflects the sun like a mirror. Blue ocean soaks up the sun like a solar panel. That's called a feedback loop. A good example of a feedback loop that most people have experienced is the piercing sound when a microphone gets too close to its speaker. What is happening in the Arctic is a feedback loop like that, but for temperatures. This is Dr. Peter Wadhams from Cambridge University. This guy has been going under the sea ice with a submarine since the 1970s. He's led over 50 expeditions where they measure ice thickness using a submarine sonar. When it comes to Arctic sea ice, he is by far the most experienced and knowledgeable person on Earth. He just published this book called A Farewell to Ice. In this book, he explains why he is certain there will be no ice left after 2025. He's a bit of a controversial figure among scientists, but only scientists that haven't been in the Arctic the last 10 years. Okay, so good scientists always look at something from multiple angles, right? So let's do that. Let's look at our predicament from the angle of temperature rise. Here's NASA's latest video about temperature rise. It says 2019 was the second hottest year on record. Globally, temperatures were more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the 19th century. During the Northern Hemisphere summer, water pooled on top of the Greenland ice sheet as ice melted. Large, intense fires burned from Alaska and Siberia to Australia. This continues a long-term trend of warming around the world driven by rising greenhouse gas levels. The last decade was the warmest on record, and the last 5 years have been the warmest 5 years on record. This illustration is called the warming stripes. Far left is 1850, and each stripe to the right is 1 year of global annual mean temperature difference up until 2018. It is a visualization that went viral. It was made by Ed Hawkins from the United Nations IPCC. He also created the climate spiral animation shown in the bottom right. The 6 hottest years since records began have been 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019. They all occurred in the last 6 years. Looks a bit like Jenga, doesn't it? Looks like the end of a game of Jenga. So let's switch gears a bit and talk about the United Nations, the IPCC, the people who have the responsibility to tell the truth about the climate crisis. They are universally regarded as the experts. The IPCC is a branch of the United Nations. It's thousands of consultants, politicians, and volunteer scientists. Unfortunately, a lot of the scientific details are lost in translation. Fox News says IPCC are alarmists. Unfortunately, the opposite is true. United Nations IPCC reports are shockingly understated. Remember that game Telephone from back in the day? It's a lot like that. The message the scientists are giving is filtered and negotiated by thousands of politicians and translators, some of whom do not believe in global warming in the first place. In the past, they have predicted sea level rise that were lower than what had already been observed. The most infuriating thing is this lie that we have 12 years to change. Saying we have 12 years to change is not treating our predicament like it's an emergency. The IPCC and these COP people from the Council of Parties have these annual meetings that always end with celebrations. They should be panicking, right? But all their events involve fanfare and self-congratulations. The IPCC and these COP people have this delusional goal to stay under 1.5 C of warming. The IPCC has changed. Now they're saying that plus 1.5 C of warming is a lot worse than what they had thought. It said, quote, limiting global warming to 1.5 C would require rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. You can tell we are in trouble just by looking at their faces, right? It looks like we're in trouble, right? This special report shows that we are nearly at plus 1.5 C right now. They said that on land, we had already experienced warming of more than 1.5 C above pre-industrial levels. They made it clear that plus 2 C of warming would be catastrophic to our civilization. If you think the coronavirus is causing fiscal crises, then what do you think happens when the East and West coasts are underwater? Unfortunately, the latest science indicates that it's even worse than the grim IPCC reports. This is why plus 2 C of warming, the amount at which the IPCC said would be too much for our civilization to handle, it's already locked in. Okay, so at the end of 2019, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration had us at plus 1.4 C of warming on land. Some think it's a bit more, some think it's a bit less, but it's definitely in the ballpark of plus 1.4 C. The NOAA is leader of the world when it comes to temperature measurements. Then there's this thing called global dimming. This is a 2018 peer-reviewed paper on it. It's not complicated. It just says that we have yet to see the full warming of the CO2 in our atmosphere because we're being shaded by our pollution. Basically, if we focus on cleaning up our emissions, we will allow more sunlight to reach and heat the earth by a lot. Unfortunately, this is exactly what is happening right now during the pandemic, right? Emissions are going down, but the CO2 is still in the atmosphere. So we were at 1.4 C, plus 1.4 C at the end of 2019, right? And the IPCC said plus 1.5 C isn't safe. And if we reduce emissions without removing CO2, Earth loses its smog sunshade. By itself, global dimming brings us in the ballpark of plus 2 C of warming. And then you take into account the carbon lag. The carbon lag has been documented in peer-reviewed articles since about 2005. It's not complicated. It just says that it takes CO2 emissions 10 years to begin warming the planet. This then begs the question, What have emissions been like the last 10 years? How's that green revolution going? Maybe renewables have helped us a little bit in the last 10 years, maybe? Yikes. Looks like emissions have only accelerated since 2010. The most conservative estimates of what's still coming down the pipe due to the carbon lag is an additional 0.7 C of warming. So it's not complicated, right? 1.4 C of warming already, plus 0.6 C minimum once we reduce emissions, which is like what's happening right now, and plus 0.7 C from the carbon lag. 1.4 plus 0.6 plus 0.7 equals 2.7 C of warming already locked in. Keep in mind, that's before we factor in humans, right? 2.7 C is if we were already net zero. That's why the CO2 level just reached a record high a few days ago, right? You saw it was 217. The drastically lower emissions from the pandemic won't actually begin helping the planet until about 10 years from now. And we're not even close to net zero, right? This is all if we were already net zero, 2.7 C. The mess we are in is unfathomable. It's a perfect storm of too much information, misinformation, and not enough information. But don't take my word for it. Let's see what the experts, the university professors with PhDs, are saying about our predicament. Professor Jem Bendell from the University of Cumbria wrote, "There will be a near-term collapse in society with serious ramifications for the lives of readers." Professor Ira Leifer from UC Santa Barbara Gauchos says, "Some scientists are indicating we should make plans to adapt to a +4 C hotter world. While prudent, one wonders what portion of the population could adapt to such a world. My view is that it's just a few thousand people seeking refuge in the Arctic or Antarctica." And here's University of Alaska's Natalia Shakova. She's one of the world's foremost authorities on methane hydrates. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas that is seeping out from the Arctic permafrost. Dr. Shakova authored one of the only peer-reviewed journal articles about permafrost methane releases. The reason why not much attention is on the permafrost methane is because it's in Russia, right? And for obvious reasons, one of the only Americans Russia trusts to do research on the permafrost on the Russian side of the Arctic is Natalia Shakova, right? She's a Russian. She's an immigrant from Russia. This is her addressing the Russian government recently. All their observations are showing imminent anomalous methane release, a methane burp, if you will. You can tell by the expression on her face that this is not good news for humankind. The East Siberian Arctic Shelf is home to over 20% of the planet's methane. It's a shallow area of the Arctic Ocean that was covered in ice year-round up until, about 10, 20 years ago. Subsea permafrost methane doesn't get processed in the water column. It's too shallow in the subsea permafrost. So it just goes right from the shallow water into the atmosphere. Methane is far more powerful of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. This is a recent video from Siberia of some fishermen checking out a flooded crater from a methane explosion. You can tell it's methane because of the guy's face. He's wincing from the smell of methane. And because of the setting, right? It looks like Siberian tundra. The bottom CNN article was from a few months ago. It says, Russian scientists say they found the highest ever flares of methane in the Arctic waters. The flares are shown on the graphic on the left. Arctic scientists are describing those methane releases as dragon's breath or as flamethrowers. This is a recent article from NASA about methane releases in the Arctic. It says, unexpected future boost of methane possible from Arctic permafrost. Last, but certainly not least, this is Dr. Guy R. McPherson, Professor Emeritus, University of Arizona Wildcats. He says, specifically, I predict that there will be no humans on Earth by 2026, based on projections of near-term planetary temperature rise and the demise of myriad species that support our own existence. Check out his blog. It's called Nature Bats Last. He's also controversial, but his argument is compelling, and he has a PhD in this field. So what does this all mean? In concrete terms, what does climate change actually mean for Americans? Seems like climate is not just about polar bears or something to do with the Amazon or Australia, right? Go ahead and ask anyone that works in insurance. Climate change means fiscal crises. Fiscal crises means the poor get the rug pulled out from under them. Guess what happens after that? All hell breaks loose. That's what happens. The academic term for it is social collapse. It's not complicated. It just means the end of civilization. It means America destroyed. If you want to know what the end of civilization might look like for us, check out Somalia. Check out Afghanistan. Have a look at Syria. Those are just examples of what happens after fiscal crises. Think zombie apocalypse, but instead of zombies, it's just your starving neighbors. Think war on an unimaginable scale. On a planet with 3,750 active nuclear warheads, right? There's like 100,000 nukes on planet Earth, but 3,750 of them are ready to go, just on the push of a button. So we're not talking about Cold Wars here. We're talking about hot nuclear war. This is heavy stuff, right? I want anyone at home watching this to know that any and all feelings or reactions to this are appropriate. I'm really scared too. This is terrifying stuff for me. I'm really curious. I'd like to know how people are feeling right now, given what I just said. And I can't tell, we're at home, right? This is the digital headed for extinction talk. So, but I'm going to ask that you please just identify these feelings. Just I'm going to start naming. I'm going to name a few different feelings, and just try to identify them if that's what you're feeling, so that it's easier to work through them, and then we can talk about what we can do about it. So if anyone's feeling shock, this stuff is shocking, right? Completely understandable to be in shock. Fear, I'm scared. This stuff scares me. It's completely understandable. Anger. Yeah, I'm angry too. You might also be angry. Sadness. This stuff is terribly sad. Motivation. Okay. So now for the hard part of this talk. The hard part is knowing that there's something you can do about it. That's the hard part. It's called systematic social science. The nice thing about knowing the science of climate change, the natural science, is that you can be absolutely sure that it's true. Social science is no different. But first we have to accept the truth. What do I mean by accept the truth? Well, I'm sure some of the people watching this have been working very hard for many, many years, right? Doing your best, trying to create a semi-decent world, making all these great choices and being good role models. The courses, the retreats, the emails, the marches, the protests, the petitions, donating to this, that, or the other foundation. And what happened? Nothing. That's what happened. Absolutely zero meaningful change. Over 60% of emissions that humans have ever put in our atmosphere has come after Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. Think about that. So let's be honest with ourselves here. Where has sustainability and going green actually gotten us? It's gotten us nowhere, right? There's been zero meaningful change for decades. For nearly 30 years, everyone's been doing all this good stuff. These NGOs doing positive things, being great people and role models, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, okay? But this is an effing nightmare, right? Like, what the hell happened the last 30 years? Environmentalism, as we know it, is an astronomical failure. That's the truth. Unfortunately, everywhere you look, there's this saying of how you can protect the planet, or 10 things you can do to save the planet. It's a sinister narrative that only benefits oil and gas industries. We're told over and over again about this fairy tale about how personal choices protect the planet. We should be pointing our fingers at the ones most responsible, but these environmental movements point to meat eaters and litter bugs. Listen, 71% of all emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution can be attributed to just 100 corporations. And guess what? Every Green New Deal around the world is earmarked for net zero 2050. Fossil fuel industries, the ones most responsible for our predicament, are currently being helped by Greenpeace, 350.org, and most all environmentalists. Right? That doesn't make sense. It's all wrong. They're trying to do the right thing, right? And the sentiment is admirable. I'm sure that they're not intending to help oil and gas industries, but intentions do not matter. What matters is what actually happens. And what is happening is a handful of fossil fuel magnates are exterminating everything beautiful about the world for money, a social construct. Because that's what the science says, right? At this time, the world is being destroyed. We simply cannot wait any longer for reform. This is what the sustainability movement is failing to understand, right? We can't wait any longer for the government to do nothing. And accepting that is the first step in understanding what needs to be done.
The biggest crisis.
So let's be clear. This predicament that we are in does not start with you. It starts where it starts. Whoever created it. It starts with oil and gas industries. They're the most responsible, so they need to be held accountable. But our government isn't currently holding them accountable, right? It's our government that has allowed this to happen. Our elected officials have the power to legislate against corporations and their shareholders. We forget that corporations are not
humanity has ever encountered. Climate breakdown, ecological breakdown, Earth systems breakdown, all happening in front of our eyes. The scale and the speed of it just defies belief. It's so grave and so big. And it's perfectly clear that the existing political system and economic system is not fit for purpose. Business as usual, politics as usual, is not going to get us out of this horrendous mess. We need system change. And what that requires, as history shows, is massive non-violent civil disobedience. We need to create the biggest movements there have ever been to confront the biggest crisis there has ever been.
Not permitted to look after the common good. The goal of a corporation is strictly to increase value for its shareholders. And that means it doesn't matter how many protesters are outside BlackRock. So who can we hold accountable for this mess? Who's letting fossil fuel industries run amok? Who has the responsibility and the power to actually do something about this enormous problem? It's the government, right? Our government has sat idle for decades while oil and gas industries destroy our only home. Our government has the responsibility and the power to do something about this. Unfortunately, they have been bought and paid for by the fossil fuel lobby. It's not complicated, right? We need system change. It is a devastating realization, but facts matter, yeah? So it's time for us to confront reality. Just because we don't like something does not mean it isn't true. This is George Monbiot in the UK on the left, and the Green New Deal on the right shows net zero 2050. The fact of the matter is, there is no greater crime than this. There is no greater crime ever in the history of humankind. Nothing holds a candle to the extermination that our government is willingly allowing to happen. It's this place called Bangladesh, right? 160 million humans living at or below sea level. Lots of poverty. It's surrounded on all sides by ocean and India. A few years back, India built a wall across the entirety of its border. So what do you think is happening as the sea level rises? At this time, millions of humans are being displaced. Humans suffering on a massive scale. That's happening right now. What does that picture remind you of? So there's been absolutely zero meaningful changes for decades, right? So should we just cross our fingers and hope for the best? Maybe the next administration will save us. No, because that would be irresponsible. It's this thing called civic duty, right? Civic duty is something that we've been told we should forget. It's the quiet life, or work hard and everything will be fine. But there's another story. It's that we belong to a society, that we are citizens, and that we have obligations as well as rights. And if we want to live in a society that is semi-decent, then sometimes you got to step up. It's all in the preamble, right? The preamble is the purpose of government. That's what it's known as. I mean, there's been absolutely zero meaningful changes for decades, right? rebellion is all about. It's about doing the right thing, fulfilling our societal obligations, stepping to it, not running away from it. It's about mass participation, nonviolent civil disobedience. There are two simple reasons why civil disobedience works. The first reason is disruption. No one pays any attention to you unless you create disruption. Disruption increases the economic and reputational costs of the opponent. I am not talking about protests. Remember School Strike Day? September 21st, 2019, over 20,000 people marched in San Francisco for climate change. And what happened? Nothing happened. Because a march doesn't create disruption. It doesn't disrupt business as usual. It's there and then it's gone, right? Same goes for swarming. You're there and then you're gone. You're there and then you're gone. Great effort, but protests and marches simply do not work. Here's a good example of the power of disruption, the power of mass participation, nonviolent civil disobedience. This is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This picture is from Albany, Georgia. Doc looks that way because he had just been defeated. He was about to give up on the civil rights movement. Albany's Chief Pritchett had beaten MLK at his own game. Pritchett was able to spread the protesters out enough so that his jails wouldn't be filled. Chief Pritchett diluted the strength of the SCLC's actions. Pritchett even paid Dr. King's fines and let him out of jail. Doc didn't know how to proceed. He retreated from Albany back to Birmingham, Alabama. He was frustrated and defeated. Keep in mind that back then, Doc was considered a troublemaker. That's including in the black community. He didn't have overwhelming support. In fact, at the time of his assassination, only 1/3 of black churches in the South supported him. The stakes were simply too high for Dr. King's supporters. They couldn't keep going to jail. It was landlords and employers to worry about, and mouths that needed to be fed. Dr. King didn't know how to proceed. Everyone around him had too much skin in the game. The civil rights movement was done. It was finished. Nobody wanted to get arrested with Doc. After church one day back in Birmingham, Paul White of Alabama Public Radio told Dr. King that he had the solution to his problem. DJ Tall Paul White was a celebrity among the local Birmingham youth. Paul told Dr. King that if he really wanted to fill up the jails, he could help him do that with kids. At first, Dr. King thought DJ Tall Paul was just being stupid, like it was just a joke from the funny guy on the radio. But DJ Tall Paul was not playing. DJ Tall Paul was smart. He understood that the only way to disrupt racism as usual was to literally fill up the jail. DJ Tall Paul wanted system change. It took some time, but Dr. King eventually got on the same page as Tall Paul. Filling up the jails with kids was genius. Without Tall Paul, we wouldn't even know who Dr. King is today. That's the truth. Dr. King thought if his goal was mass participation, civil disobedience, then he should be strategic. He needed to do what provided the best chance of success. Kids in school don't have employers, landlords, bills, or other responsibilities. Plus, as far as the state was concerned, a single child was just as costly to house as an adult. In other words, arresting and housing a dozen kids was the same cost to the government as it were a dozen adults. Dr. King was convinced filling up the jails with school kids was the best option. One of the sermons before the demonstration day, or D-Day, what they called it.
Without enough volunteers to continue the protest, King and other leaders enlisted hundreds of young school children to keep the marches going and fill up the jails. The young African-American student protesters would gather here on the steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church and hear inspirational speeches from civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King.
Give the call.
I'll never forget listening but during the math and hearing a man say, if the children participate in this demonstration, in this peaceful demonstration, all of America will see that even children understand the difference between right and wrong education.
Afterward, he told his parents he wanted to march.
And they said, absolutely not. And I was very upset. And I said to them,
they said, this is our future, and we want to help shape it.
Martin Luther King Jr. They would then file from the church and walk across the street to a park where they were determined to demonstrate peacefully for equal rights.
I was arrested after we got about a block away from the church in this area.
Janice Kelsey was 16 years old when she and her schoolmates were jailed.
My mind was made up. I was going to participate. I was going to go to jail. I wanted to get my freedom.
Then on the second day of the student demonstrations, things turned.
Was a code word for it was D-Day. He said, if the kids participate in this peaceful demonstration, then everyone will see that even children know the difference between right and wrong. Demonstration Day, or D-Day, May 2nd, 1963, is now what historians consider the catalyst for the civil rights movement. There would be no MLK Jr. in the civil rights movement without the Children's Crusade of 1963. The kids thought, this is our future, and we want to help shape it. This is what happened the second day of the 1963 Children's Crusade. These pictures with the fire hoses were seen around the world, and it sparked outrage, sparked riots across America too. It put the injustice on America on center stage for all to see. It caused riots in most major cities across America, and America's hypocrisy was in full display for all the world to see. It started with just over 100 kids arrested on D-Day. But as soon as other schools found out about the sacrifice that those 100 kids had made, it inspired many other schools around Birmingham to show up the following days. By the end of the week, 4,000 kids had been arrested. Let's keep in mind that in 1963, it was common for arrested blacks to never be seen nor heard from again. They'd end up being lynched. They were fighting against a system that was actively opposing them. Birmingham had police officers that were active members of the Ku Klux Klan. The police in this picture might have been wearing KKK hoods. When I look at the girl in this picture, I think of two things. I think of bravery, and I think of civic duty. "21 days after D-Day, Alabama Supreme Court legislates. Then in June 1963, less than a month later after D-Day, the federal government legislates.
Which have taken place in Birmingham over the last few days, to my mind, mark the nonviolent movement coming of age. This is the first time in the history of our struggle that we have been able literally to fill the jails. And in a real sense, this is the fulfillment of a dream, for I've always felt that if we could fill the jails in our witness for freedom, it would be a magnificent expression of the determination of the Negro and a marvelous way to lay the whole issue before the conscience of the local and national community. And I think in a real sense, this Birmingham movement is one of the most inspiring developments in the whole nonviolent struggle.
JFK submits what would later become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Filling up the jail is powerful, right? And so that's the second reason civil disobedience works. It's called sacrifice. No one likes to talk about it, but the fact of the matter is, the only reason we're sitting here today in a relatively free society is because of millions of people sacrificing their liberty and ultimately their lives for our common good. That's their legacy. This is Dr. King explaining why filling up the jails is powerful. This is Bayard Rustin, Dr. King's mentor. He said, "To be afraid is to act as if the truth were not true." So the goal of Extinction Rebellion is system change, right? We need to put pressure on the government. We must increase their economic and reputational costs. Put their hypocrisy on display for all the world to see. We have to do this, right? So America's emissions, our cumulative emissions, are double China's, right? Our cumulative emissions is far and away the most on the earth in the world. We're the most responsible for the predicament. When it's all said and done, it's not going to be about the what happened around Germany, right, in the 1940s. It's going to be about the extermination that the Americans did to the planet. Right? We're the most responsible. Our cumulative emissions are double China's. I mean, Extinction Rebellion, there's no guarantee that this is going to work, right? But what we can be certain of is that politics as usual will continue to fail, just as it has been the last 30 years. I mean, for me, this whole situation is unacceptable, right? I have to do something. And I really, truly believe that mass participation, civil disobedience, could work, right? I think it
Traumatize the blatant injustice and to demand
it might actually help. It might actually be the difference, right? And I think I've explained it pretty well, right? So you should know what needs to be done also, too, right? I mean, you saw the graphs, there's been zero meaningful change, right? We need to dramatize this blatant injustice. And that's how you do it, is with mass participation, civil disobedience. Right? So what are you all about? How will you continue living your life knowing this without making a mockery of what you stand for?